Hello again. Welcome to the the fifth presentation of the 2021 BAPT Type Centenary Symposium. It's a pleasure to welcome Vicky Jo Varner, PhD, here tonight. We've got, she's a Jungian scholar from California, associated with the Pacifica Graduate Institute, I believe, as well. And she's going to read her paper contribution for this symposium. Thank you, Vicky Jo.
Thank you, Richard. And yes, this is just going to be a straightforward, boring reading the paper. I apologize. I can do the fun, bouncy, interactive stuff too, but I wanted to do a straightforward academic paper because I thought that was what was called for. So I have to say I've been researching this paper for about 2.5 years. I had tons of research I was pulling from. I threw it all together and then I had to boulderize it to make sure I could get it into the 1 hour period. So be aware that it's shrunk down significantly from the point I started at. So welcome to the psychology wars, which is a subset of the science wars. Or we might pattern our language after Jung and refer to them as the problem of science or the problem of psychology. Now here's one way it has played out. The other day I was on social media exchanging thoughts about typology when somebody intruded and shouted everybody down about how their assessment of choice was better than our assessment of choice. It was a rude and uncomfortable encounter, not unlike other confrontations of a similar nature. The difference is that their frequency seems to be increasing. I dare say you can guess which assessment came under attack and what its suggested replacement was. The irony is that while I am a longtime MBTI master practitioner, I hardly ever use assessments in my type discovery work. I prefer to teach and invite my clients to find themselves in the material. This provides them with competence and confidence so they are not left wondering whether or not they have found the right fit. It is usually my corporate clients who like the assessments, which provide them with an entry point and a justification for holding a diversity workshop. My PhD is in depth psychology with an emphasis on Jungian and archetypal studies. That is a mouthful, but I wish to emphasize how the PH in PhD stands for philosophy. I am a doctor of philosophy. By definition, everyone with a PhD is implicitly supposed to be interested in the philosophy that demarcates and differentiates their field. It is a given. For this reason, I am intrigued by the philosophical premise that underlies models and assessments based on psychological type. I am less interested in the science or the psychometrics and do not purport to be a mathematician, a statistician, a psychometrician, or scientist. This is how I stay in my own lane with respect to this topic. And it is from this lane that I hope to craft my message in a way that targets other academics, other philosophers in the realm of psychology as well. I will also be developing this paper in proper academic fashion by defining my terms and developing various arguments. And here I use the term arguments in the academic sense. I will start by attempting to define philosophy, which in itself is a challenging undertaking. Plato's idea was that philosophy begins in wonder. He declared, "You must understand that none of the gods are seekers after truth. They do not long for wisdom because they are wise. And why should the wise be seeking the wisdom that is already theirs? Nor, for that matter, do the ignorant seek the truth or crave to be made wise. For wisdom is concerned with the loveliest of things, and love is the love of what is lovely. And so it follows that love is a lover of wisdom, and being such, he is placed between wisdom and ignorance. This strews the path to wisdom with paradoxes, as wisdom becomes associated with the passionate search for it. The good, which is the object of wisdom as knowledge, cannot be taken as a direct object of knowledge and is therefore unteachable. It can only be approached dialectically. And it is not a knowledge attained or learned, but rather is called forth as a remembrance of something already familiar and known. So one sets out to find out what one already knows in a modality which is not cognitive, but conative and affective. In Plato, wisdom is connected with a, quote, prior knowledge, which guides all one's seeking and questioning, close quote. In late Neoplatonism, wisdom is considered to be a philosophical approximation to the divine. Quote, the ideal is a putting in order, a manner of thinking and an acting according to the correspondence of all things natural and divine, a revelation of cosmos which reveals the place of the human in it and thereby leads to a fundamental balance, close quote. It was Pythagoras who coined the term philosophy, and he sought to raise the consciousness of his students and himself by the contemplation of the eternal principles of reality. In contrast, the philosopher Rorty claims that philosophy is simply a genre of literature invented by Plato. Now, through this long and convoluted defining of philosophy, I hope I have demonstrated the level of abstraction I prefer operating from, and it represents an ideal level I hope to attain going forward in this exploration. Of necessity, this paper will be more horizontal than vertical, as I try to cover more ground than any philosopher ought to attempt in a single sitting. Now, before I expand my philosophical arguments, in what may seem like a contradiction to my previous declarations, I shall lay some groundwork by surveying briefly the current state of play as regards the nature of personality assessment, partly because it is scholarly practice to investigate the predecessors of new developments in the field. Now, this will necessitate providing some context, which I refer to as origin stories. But let us first define personality types. In a general sense, a type is a group or category of things distinguished by the common characteristics of its members. A personality type, therefore, is a category of people who exhibit a particular combination of psychological characteristics, the assumption being that this combination is unique and distinguishes the type from others. Since ancient times, there has been a great deal of speculation about types of people. Personality psychology is the study of a whole human individual. It concentrates on many aspects of a person's personality. Personality includes the question, what is it to be a person? Types, traits, and the like. Personality psychology, although scientific, is the most philosophical field in psychology. The question of differentiated personalities harks back, of course, to Hippocrates and the four humors, the melancholic, sanguine, choleric, and phlegmatic types. They are the ancient origin of the whole premise, and it is common to see them credited in any historical overview of personality typology. Hippocrates is followed by Plato, Galen, Paracelsus, Adickes, and Spranger. Biological personality models have been with us for more than 2 millennia, with Plato's organization of the tripartite soul into reason, emotion, and desire remaining the classic organization of the study of individual differences. Indeed, with the addition of behavior, the study of psychology may be said to be the study of affect, emotion, behavior, cognition, reason, and motivation, desire, as organized by Plato. Around 300 BC, Theophrastus asked a fundamental question of personality theory that is still of central concern to us today, quote, why is it that while all Greece lies under the same sky and all the Greeks are educated alike, nevertheless, we are all different with respect to personality, close quote. Later, Galen's empirical work, based upon comparative neuroanatomy, provided support for Plato's tripartite organization of affect, cognition, and desire. Although current work does not use the same biological concepts, the search for a biological basis of individual differences continues to this day. This fourfold typology of personality persisted through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, and was later found in the writings of Kant. Beginning with Wilhelm Wundt, 1903, these old typologies were abandoned. Instead, the basic dimensions on which people varied were identified. During the 18th century, philosophers divided psychology's subject matter into three distinct faculties, as noted already: cognition, affect, and conation. And in early experiments, affective, cognitive, and conative responses continued to be considered inseparable, complementary aspects of human experience. But in subsequent psychological research, these three faculties came to be seen as sovereign, unrelated domains that have been studied in isolation and without reference to each other. In the late 19th century, Wundt reorganized the original four temperaments into a two-dimensional model that was scrutinized with great interest. Wundt, 1832 to 1920, was a German physiologist, philosopher, and professor known today as one of the founders of modern psychology. Wundt distinguished psychology as a science from philosophy and biology, and was the first person ever to call himself a psychologist. He is widely regarded as the father of experimental psychology. In 1874, Wundt wrote the first textbook pertaining to the field of experimental psychology. He opened the first laboratory exclusively devoted to psychological studies, thereby marking the official birth of psychology as an independent field of study. Wundt endeavored to redefine the broad field of psychology, carving out its place between philosophy and physiology, between the humanities and the natural sciences. In place of the metaphysical definition as a science of the soul, came the definition based on scientific theory of empirical psychology as, quote, a psychology of consciousness with its own categories and epistemological principles, close quote. Psychology claimed to examine the, quote, entire experience in its immediately subjective reality, close quote. The task of psychology purported to analyze the processes of consciousness, assess their complex connections, and identify the laws governing such relationships. Wundt's concepts were developed over the course of nearly 60 years of research and teaching that led him from neurophysiology to psychology and philosophy. One needs to call on physiology, philosophy, logic, epistemology, and ethics in order to fully grasp Wundt's psychology. Wundt heartily aligned with a sentiment of Gottfried Leibniz, who wrote, quote, nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses, except the intellect itself, close quote. Leibniz asserted that, quote, souls act according to the laws of final causes through aspirations, ends, and means. Bodies act according to the laws of efficient causes, i.e. the laws of motion. And these two realms, that of efficient causes and that of final causes, while not interchangeable, harmonize with one another, close quote. Wundt coined the term psychophysical parallelism as an echo of Leibniz, which claimed, quote, wherever there are regular relationships between mental and physical phenomena, the two are neither identical nor convertible into one another because they are per se incomparable, but they are associated with one another in the way that certain mental processes regularly correspond to certain physical processes, or figuratively expressed, run parallel to one another, close quote. This distinction proposed two fundamentally different ways of considering Wundt's postulated psychophysical unit as two sides of the same coin, if you will. This notion will become more prominent later on in this paper. This brings us to the 20th century and C.G. Jung's theory of psychological types. When the first Swiss edition of Psychological Types was published in 1921, Jung wrote in the foreword that his book was, quote, the fruit of nearly 20 years' work in the domain of practical psychology, close quote, and later noted that, quote, these four functions were not a scheme I had simply invented and applied to psychology. On the contrary, it took me quite a long time to discover them, close quote. It was evident that he had been contemplating these typical differences as far back as 1902, when he was performing medical work with nervous patients in the Berkeley Institute as a young assistant physician. He observed how the attitude of the patients to the external world tended to gravitate towards schizophrenia or hysteria. As early in his career as this, he characterized hysteria as a pathology of exaggerated extroversion and schizophrenia as a pathology of exaggerated introversion. Jung explained, quote, with the help of Wundt's association experiments, I was trying to evaluate the peculiarities of neurotic states of mind as exactly as possible. This work led directly to a new question, namely the problem of attitude, which exerts a decisive influence upon the associative reaction, close quote. During subsequent years, Jung continued to observe these peculiar psychological differences. For example, while conducting his famous word association experiments, he described, quote, two well-characterized types. With the first type, subjective and often emotionally charged experiences were present in their reactions. With the second, the reactions showed an objective and impersonal disposition, close quote. Jung thereby connected the study of reaction times and word associations and eventually declared how, quote, from these researches there emerged a psychological typology which distinguished two attitude types, the extrovert and the introvert, and four function types corresponding to the four orienting functions of consciousness, close quote. But I am getting ahead of myself. In 1913, Jung delivered a seminal and controversial paper titled A Contribution to the Study of Psychological Types at the Psychoanalytic Congress in Munich. This paper, included as an appendix in Psychological Types, presented his initial thoughts on the subject of typology, specifically targeting crucial differences in his approach to psychology as contrasted with those of Freud and Adler, heralding the rudiments of his theory of psychological types. Throughout this lecture, and with a glowering Freud in attendance, Jung countered several of Freud's cherished ideas. This paper was clearly the germ of Jung's later work on this topic and was the concluding salvo in his ruptured friendship with Freud. About 10 years after his initial observations of extroversion and introversion, Jung noted that these two types did not provide a complete picture. He stated, quote, what struck me now was the undeniable fact that while people may be classed as introverts or extroverts, this does not account for the tremendous differences between individuals in either class. So great indeed are these differences that I was forced to doubt whether I had observed correctly in the first place. It took nearly 10 years of observation and comparison to clear up this doubt, close quote. Now, contrary to popular opinion, evolving the theory of psychological types was hardly a solitary operation. During the years leading up to the eventual publication of the book, Psychological Types, Jung was simultaneously developing his understanding of the types in other realms as he engaged in numerous discussions on types at the Psychological Club of Zurich. His development of the types theory was, in the words of Shamdasani, a collaborative enterprise, and typology was a central research topic in the Zurich School as a whole during this period. The subject matter was undoubtedly enhanced by the contributions of many insightful individuals exploring the topic and sharing their discoveries. Jung used the Analytical Psychology Club of Zurich as a think tank, forming discussion groups to talk about psychological types in an attempt to evolve and refine the model. These associates, among them his wife Emma, were making presentations, writing papers on these topics, presenting hypotheses, etc. Maria Moltzer, a former assistant of Jung and analyst, at one stage suggested the inclusion of intuition as a cognitive function, which Jung initially resisted, but eventually incorporated into his overall theory and acknowledged Moltzer in a footnote in the book. Elsewhere in Psychological Types, however, Jung claimed to derive his sensation and intuition types from Nietzsche, writing, quote, Nietzsche's concepts thus lead us to the principles of a third and a fourth psychological type, which one might call aesthetic types, as opposed to the rational types, thinking and feeling. These are the intuitive and sensation types, close quote. Later, during a series of lectures he presented on Nietzsche's book about Zarathustra, Jung again acknowledged him as his inspiration, claiming that Nietzsche, quote, is one of the first protagonists for irrationalism, close quote. As was his fashion, Jung did not present multiple case studies to readers in order to validate his theory, but rather he treated the book as an opportunity to expound his philosophy and trace it back through history. He was more interested in the idea than its application. In later years, he stated defensively, quote, critics commonly fall into the error of assuming that the types were, so to speak, fancy-free and were forcibly imposed on the empirical material. In face of this assumption, I must emphasize that my typology is the result of many years of practical experience. I am first and foremost a doctor and practicing psychotherapist, and all my formulations are based on the experience in the hard course of my daily professional work. What I have to say in this book, therefore, has, sentence by sentence, been tested 100-fold in the practical treatment of the sick and originated with them in the first place. Naturally, these medical experiences are intelligible only to one who is professionally concerned with the treatment of psychic complications. It is not, therefore, the fault of the layman if certain of my statements strike him as strange, or if he thinks my typology is the product of idyllically undisturbed hours in the study, close quote. At the end of the book, Jung claimed not to believe that his own theory was the be-all end-all. He stated that, quote, I have made it very clear that I do not hold mine to be the only true or possible type theory, close quote. In this sense, he was taking the high ground with regards to his theory, thereby suggesting that he did not consider his model to be set in stone, although he avowed that, quote, I would not for anything dispense with this compass on my psychological journeys of discovery, close quote. Now, while the types were his most original work, the book on types was the only book in the collected works he wrote on the subject of consciousness. All the rest dealt with the unconscious. This located him in the field of depth psychology, which is ironic since he claimed, quote, my own course of development was influenced primarily by the French school and later by Wundt's psychology, close quote. Wundt's approach to psychology did not admit to the existence of an unconscious, leading a trend toward treating psychology as strictly about consciousness. Among Jung's many contributions, shedding light into the workings of the personal and collective psyche, the sum of which are too extensive to cover in this review, his typology model is one of his longest lasting legacies that continues to enjoy widespread and popular use today. As a result of the several instruments created to explore a person's typological preferences, the most in vogue being the MBTI, the number of people who have encountered some form of Jung's ideas on typology is estimated in the hundreds of millions. 18 years after Jung published Psychological Types, we enter the era that started creating assessments, which brings us back to the main angle of our story. Now, on several occasions, I have received skeptical pushback from individual and corporate clients who were distrustful during typology workshop encounters. I immediately inquire, are you questioning the assessment or are you questioning the theory? In Taoist terms, never has the finger pointing at the moon been so badly mistaken for the moon itself. The theory and the assessment have been collapsed to the point where they are viewed as one and the same in the eyes of many people. It is common on social media to see people asking each other, "What's your MBTI?" This is an indication of how badly collapsed these two ideas are. They are not interchangeable, and this is causing no end of trouble. The collapse is dangerous because assessments distract us from questioning the philosophy that informs it. Assessments are the front end of a particular philosophy lurking on the back end. The history of psychological type assessments has been extensive and varied. The first milestone in assessment development was the use of psychometrics to identify type preferences. Cranton and Duke noted how in the 1940s, Gray and Wheelwright, two Jungian analysts, and Isabel Myers, a self-taught student of Jung's writings, independently began their work on the development of a type assessment. After much struggle and research, Myers' assessment, called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, was published in 1962, while Gray and Wheelwright's instrument, called variously the Gray-Wheelwright, Gray-Wheelwrights, plural, and later the Jungian Type Survey, abbreviated to JTS, was produced in 1964. Gray and Wheelwright gave mixed signals with respect to the creation of their inventory. On the one hand, they stripped it of any overt association when they operationalized Jung's theory, declaring, quote, "We have avoided as far as possible entanglement with Jung's other psychological principles, which may be unacceptable to other schools of depth psychology," close quote. Yet at other times, they argued for the instrument's legitimacy due to the authors having backgrounds as experienced Jungian analysts, perhaps in contrast to their nemesis, Isabel Myers, who was likewise shunned by the psychological establishment. With, quote, "no training in psychology, no knowledge of test construction, no lab, no funding, not even a university affiliation," she was derisively referred to as the little old lady in tennis shoes. In contrast to the MBTI, Gray and Wheelwright's Jungian Type Survey was most often used in clinical settings, with the patient's therapist interpreting the results, while the MBTI was among the earliest self-report assessments where the final outcome relied solely on the verdict of the assessment taker. Probably as a result of good marketing, the MBTI became the most popular psychological assessment in the world, with its publisher claiming that as many as 1.5 million assessments are administered annually. The MBTI put standardized type instruments on the map internationally. Now, it will be useful to bear in mind that both of these instruments were developed prior to easy access to computer systems. Myers tabulated all of her psychometric research by hand, while Horace Gray was regarded by Wheelwright to be a good mathematician who developed the JTS calculations. Unfortunately, the small amount of psychometric research conducted on 2,000 individuals who were sampled using the JTS was largely lost during a computer crash and never reproduced. A subsequent Jungian assessment of note was the Singer-Loomis Inventory of Personality, SLIP. It was also developed by two Jungians, Singer and Lewis, and was inspired by a survey performed by Plaut, showing that even among Jungian analysts, disagreement about type patterns was rife. The SLIP did not conform to the structural rules imposed by Jung, even rejecting outright his notion of bipolar opposites and the opposites of dominant and inferior. Instead, a free-for-all approach was defiantly adopted, which allowed any function attitude to be located in any position with no rules. These three assessments dominated the landscape for a time, but with computer technology evolving and becoming more readily accessible, a small trickle of new assessments emerged onto the scene, eventually becoming a deluge. De Gregorio cataloged several typological assessments, including personal style inventory, type differentiation indicator, Cambridge type inventory, pet check, personal preferences self-description questionnaire, and Francis psychological type scales. Now, De Gregorio neglected to mention the Golden Personality Type Profiler, Golden PTP, the Gifts Compass Inventory, GCI, the Majors Personality Type Inventory, PTI, and the Pearman Personality Integrator, which likewise purported to identify one's type pattern. Every assessment in this lot was designed to help individuals identify their type preferences based on Jung's original model, although they vary widely in terms of construction, psychometric validity, and item scoring. A few scattered assessments approach the type question differently. Rather than generating 4-letter type codes, these assessments sought to produce alternative content, such as the MTRI, the FIASD, and the Cognitive Development Profile. These latter instruments generally lacked the rigorous psychometric testing normally associated with the MBTI and other mainstream assessments. On that note, and accompanying the increasing popularity of the internet in the 21st century, there has been an increasing proliferation of free online quizzes, which are typically poor knockoffs of the MBTI that attempt to capitalize on the MBTI brand name, possess no psychometric validity, and make false representations about what they measure. So as can be seen, the assessment landscape surrounding Jung's model has been wide and varied. In 1884, a contemporary of C.G. Jung, Sir Francis Galton, investigated a hypothesis that it is possible to derive a comprehensive taxonomy of human personality traits by sampling language. This is known as the lexical hypothesis. The lexical hypothesis is also known as the fundamental lexical hypothesis, lexical approach, or sedimentation hypothesis. The hypothesis is defined by two postulates. The first states that those personality characteristics that are important to a group of people will eventually become a part of that group's language. The second follows from the first, stating that more important personality characteristics are more likely to be encoded into language as a single word. Galton stated, quote, "I tried to gain an idea of the number of the more conspicuous aspects of the character by counting in an appropriate dictionary the words used to express them. I examined many pages of its index here and there as samples of the whole and estimated that it contained fully 1,000 words expressive of character, each of which has a separate shade of meaning, while each shares a large part of its meaning with some of the rest." Close quote. 2 decades passed before English language scholars picked up on his approach. A study by G.E. Partridge in 1910 listed approximately 750 English adjectives that describe mental states. And then Perkins studied Webster's dictionary in 1926 and extracted 3,000 such terms. In 1936, Gordon Allport and Henry Odbert also used Webster's, but they identified 17,953 unique terms used to describe personality or behavior. This was one of the most influential studies in the history of trait psychology. It is the most exhaustive list of personality descriptive words at the time, and was also one of the earliest attempts at classifying English language terms with the use of psychological principles. Now, this list was sorted into 4 categories and ultimately winnowed down to a list of 4,500 terms. Their work provided a foundation for other psychologists to begin determining the basic dimensions of personality. Now, it has been argued that the methods used to test the lexical hypothesis are unscientific, claiming that personality descriptive language is too broad to be captured with a single word class. Yet, psycholexical studies of personality continue to rely largely on adjectives. Because the terms are drawn from a dictionary, the emphasis is on a collective social view of personality. There is a natural pro-social bias of language in people's verbal evaluations. After all, language is an invention of group dynamics that was developed to facilitate socialization, the exchange of information, and to synchronize group activity. This social function of language therefore creates a sociability bias in verbal descriptors of human behavior. There are more words related to social than physical or even mental aspects of behavior. Now, this also leads to strong methodological flaws in this approach. Further, there is a negativity bias in emotionality, meaning that most emotions are characterized negatively, and more words describe negative rather than positive emotions in our language. Now, in the 1940s, Raymond Cattell and his colleagues used a statistical method called factor analysis to narrow down Allport's list to 16 traits. Factor analysis is a statistical method of reducing a variety of things down to a smaller number of related clusters. Following that effort, numerous psychologists examined Cattell's list and found that it could be further reduced to 5 traits. Later on, a British psychologist, Hans Eysenck, used these characteristics to create a 3-dimensional model based on psychoticism, extroversion, neuroticism, PEN. He was critical of Cattell's methodology, claiming that, quote, "We need to anchor our dimensions of personality in something more concrete than the morass of factor analysis, and biology supplies us with the necessary tools," close quote. You may never have heard of Eysenck, but he is the 3rd most cited psychologist of all time. Before his death in 1997, he had published over 1,000 journal articles and book chapters and 80 books, an average of a book chapter or article every 2 weeks for 50 years, and a book every 9 months. Unfortunately, Eysenck has had many papers retracted by the journals after his death and is thus a somewhat controversial figure. According to Fordham, Eysenck was influenced by Jung's psychological types, but rather than viewing them as categories as Jung did, Eysenck saw the categories as facets on a spectrum, and may thus be one of the individuals to confuse us all about what constitutes introversion and extroversion, since the exact same terms are now commonly used to characterize both traits and types. Eventually, later researchers asserted that Cattell's theory was too complicated and Eysenck's pen was too limited in its scope. Eventually, a 5-factor theory emerged to describe the essential traits that serve as the building blocks of personality. In particular, Louis Goldberg advocated heavily for 5 primary factors of personality, and his work was expanded upon by McCrae and Costa, who confirmed the model's validity and provided the dimensions of the model we know today: conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness to experience, and extroversion. This model became known as the Big Five and has since received much attention. It has been researched across many populations and cultures and continues to be one of the most widely accepted theories of personality today. Numerous assessments have been constructed to measure the Big Five. For example, development of the Neo-Pi began with only 3 well-researched scales called neuroticism, extroversion, and openness to experience. Later, 2 extra dimensions were hastily added, but these 2 were not as well researched. They are conscientiousness and agreeableness. Other names for the Big Five include canoe and ocean, those letters being acronyms for the 5 factors being scored. There are many others, too many to list here. Trait theory argues that individual differences reflect the fact that many of us show a greater or lesser degree of conformance to each of the dimensions that have been identified. By adding together these personality dimensions, supposedly we can account for individual differences. This theory essentially assumes that most of us are average in personality, just as most individuals are of average intelligence. Another aspect of the trait perspective is the positive and negative valences that most personality researchers associate with individuals who show an excess or deficit of a trait. This perspective is most commonly seen in the measurement of IQ. More is better, but it is just as pervasive in trait descriptions of personality. The more extroverted a person is, the more sociable and spontaneous. The more introverted, the more retiring and aloof. Individuals high in conscientiousness are well organized and self-disciplined. Those low in this factor are disorganized and weak-willed. High scores on extroversion, openness, conscientiousness, and agreeableness are therefore considered desirable. Anything less than that is considered a deficit. Thus, introversion, which is a normal way of being in the world from a Jungian standpoint, is considered to be a lack of extroversion and therefore undesirable in the Big Five model. While both the MBTI and the 5-factor model have waxed and waned over the decades in terms of popularity and public acceptance, the 5-factor model seems to be enjoying an ascendancy, while the MBTI is plummeting in the court of popular opinion, largely meaning online media and related news sources. Although a tabloid-style documentary was recently released with the intent of conducting a hatchet job on the MBTI and its corporate uses. Eysenck observed how, quote, in psychology, concepts and theories often produce a bandwagon effect that attracts a great deal of support. Both the Big Five and the MBTI have collected their share of advocates on their respective bandwagons. Unfortunately, they tend to throw ugly rocks at one another, particularly in the form of various ad hominem attacks. MBTI advocates seem to be bearing the brunt of ugliness lately, with condemnations of Jung as idolater, anti-Semitic, and most recently, racist. Isabel Myers has attracted animosity from the beginning, being disparaged as nothing more than a housewife, the little old lady in tennis shoes. And lately, she too has been portrayed as racist, which is so ironic given her reputation for celebrating diversity. It is hard to return similar salvos against the individuals affiliated with the Big Five model, since there are so many, but we can single out Eysenk's shaky reputation for publishing untenable studies and his predecessor, Galton, who created the unsavory idea of eugenics. Five-factor model aficionados further tend to disparage and dismiss the MBTI advocates as naive, gullible, and superstitious, as they liken the MBTI to astrology, horrors, and suggest that its proponents have fallen victim to the Forel or Barnum effect. Jung is derided as a guru and cult leader, still hypnotizing everyone many decades after his death. They disparage the MBTI, attacking the instrument for its supposed psychometric limitations, trafficking on the modern day themes of fake news and fact-free reporting, which are admittedly dreadful problems, but taken out of context for this purpose. They claim the MBTI lacks validity and reliability, despite all the studies conducted that state otherwise. They fault it for lacking any ability to predict, despite that kind of mechanistic determinism being rejected by Jung, and seem to maintain that the MBTI should return results as accurate as a blood test. And they hold a near religious fervor that it should meet some kind of impossible scientific standard, accompanied by fantasies of a clockwork universe. This is scientism at its best, and woe betide anyone who does not worship at its altar. What I would like to see going forward is for the five-factor model and the MBTI to be taught alongside one another as equals, so that individuals are allowed to think for themselves and consider the relative merits and drawbacks of each. I am gratified to witness a bit less emphasis on the assessments on social media and more emphasis now on learning Jung's original theory, often as it has been amplified by Dr. John Beebe and others such as Dario Nardi and Linda Behrens, who are sincerely trying to do good work in the world with typology. Having said that, I also celebrate new assessments being developed, such as the MTRI created by Steve Myers, assessments of the individual cognitive processes, and continued development of assessments that are increasingly sophisticated, such as the Majors PTI, which intends to stay as true as possible to Jung's original formulations. I am gratified that in the field of trait research, we are now looking at a model known as Hexaco, with 6 factors or dimensions that include honesty, humility, emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. Each factor is composed of traits with characteristics indicating high and low levels of the factor. Another newer one is called the ABC model, which then advanced to the ABCD model, and now is unfolding as the ABCDE model. This latter model embraces a great deal of complexity as it harks back to Plato's tripartite model of the mind, divided along the lines of affect, A, B, behavior, and C, cognition, with D, development, and E, environment, added later. While I personally do not embrace their aim of locating all personality traits in the physiological as a behavioral approach, I appreciate its greater diversity of factors that influence the development of our personality in general. It might also be noted here that models of psychology seem to be shifting from a modern to a postmodern trend, and that rather than seeing individuals as static monotheisms of consciousness, we are beginning to view them as dynamic polytheisms instead, and parts models, such as Herman's dialogical self approach, Schwartz's internal family systems, pluralistic approaches, and others are being embraced by greater and greater numbers. The Big Five approach does not seem as amenable to a postmodern approach as Jung's approach does. As Jung himself noted, a quote, disunity with oneself is the hallmark of civilized man, close quote. So much for predictability. This swings me back around to my main theme. What are the moral implications of the theory underlying these assessments? If we were to step back from the assessments and look at what they are trying to accomplish, we see how they are attempting to measure psyche, an abstract, esoteric concept that defies definition, let alone measurement. But that shall remain a topic for a separate discussion. Looking at the Big Five model, it is based on a concept of there being a singular normal type with various statistics and self-righteous scientizing used to dictate and even bully this viewpoint. In contrast, Jung observed that trying to be normal gets in the way of individuation. By definition, individuation is a process that differentiates a person from others, therefore necessarily deviating from the norm. What we know from leading type practitioners is what a difference Jung's psychological types make to some people's mindsets. Peter Myers observed that, quote, one of Isabel Myers's greatest pleasures in giving feedback after scoring a person's indicator was the occasional astonished response, what a relief to find out that it is all right to be me. Morton Kelsey observed, quote, sometimes people in their 60s come up after one of the lectures on psychological types and express the relief that for the first time in their life, they are confirmed in the legitimacy of being who they are and as they are. They say, my mother, father, teacher, and boss never liked me. It is great for me to find out I am a legitimate type. Joseph Wheelwright stated, quote, wherever you get people who tend to not conform with the stereotype of normal people, I think you'll find that types are willy-nilly of great importance to them, close quote. As Shamdasani summarized the matter, quote, for many, the language of typology provided a means for individual differences to be acknowledged and respected, close quote. It is vital to scrutinize the underlying theory behind any personality assessment and to consider what it morally conveys. A sharp and significant contrast exists between type, psychological types, and trait, Big Five, approaches concerning the moral worth of the personality characteristics they measure. The trait approach sees extroversion, agreeableness, openness, and conscientiousness as desirable qualities and deems low scores to indicate personality deficit. By contrast, the type approach insists that the polar opposite expressions of the four personality components that are rated each have intrinsic value. One is not morally or functionally superior to the other. Corbett observed, quote, I believe that practitioners who work within any particular approach are making a commitment to the underlying philosophy of that approach, whether or not they're doing so consciously. It's important to understand this. Otherwise, one is unwittingly committing oneself to a view of humanity that may not be in accord with one's real values. Many approaches which consider themselves to be scientific are unconsciously assuming a materialistic and a reductionist philosophy. They assume human behavior is nothing but the result of evolution, genetic endowment, brain processes, and culture. These approaches tend to ignore other important realms, the realm of meaning, the domain of spirituality, of the intellect and artistic concerns, and self-awareness, close quote. As a doctor of philosophy, I am herein ultimately striving to contrast the moral philosophy of diversity against a so-called normal, one-size-fits-all mindset. At a time when the world, particularly the USA, is struggling between autocracy and democracy, this issue could not be more important. Who is on the wrong side of history? In conclusion, assessments are the tips of icebergs linked downward to a grander moral philosophy lying beneath the water. If I am forced to choose an assessment, I choose the one which has an underlying philosophy that I find palatable. Everything else aside, if the Big Five promotes one right way of being in the world and the MBTI promotes 16, then my choice is made. As a philosopher, logically, ethically, morally, humanely, I feel driven to insist that all types matter. And just as Barack Obama observed, quote, when all Americans are treated as equal, we are all more free, close quote. I align with Dr. Spock in honoring infinite diversity in infinite combination. Which side shall we stand on? The human side or the non-human side? If we are on the humanistic side, we must ask of all proposed inquiries, investigations, and research, quote, how will it help people, or at least not hurt them, close quote. To the individual who intruded in my conversation on social media, I politely explained some of these drawbacks and open questions. They told me I was taking typology too seriously. I told them I had written my PhD dissertation on typology, so yes, I do take it seriously. Their response? They blocked me. Thank you.